I'm Professor Alex Shu, an adjunct assistant visiting professor at the University of Notre Dame at the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. And if you're tuning in, you are joining us for another in our series, our conversation series called Engaged, Religion and the Common Good, where we talk with academics, community leaders, students, lots of different members of in and outside of the Notre Dame community to talk about issues of religion and global affairs. I'm joined today by Professor Yuki Miyamoto at DePaul University in Chicago, an ethicist who specializes in religion, modern Japan, and nuclear ethics. Welcome, Dr. Miyamoto.
Thank you for having me, and good to see you, Alex.
It's so good to see you too. Um, so I like to start these conversations by asking a little bit um, for my interviewee to describe how they became interested in the topics that they study.
Great, thanks. Actually, I was born and grew up in Hiroshima, and my mother was 1.6 kilometers from the hypocenter, which is about a mile from the hypocenter. She was at the age of 6 years old, and I suppose that she didn't have any external injuries, which was, I don't know if fortunate is a good word here to describe it. Um, but she was later on, she had some health issues. I do not know about her health history, medical history, and partly because she didn't tell me about it, which I will talk about it in a minute, but she didn't tell me about her experiences of having the atomic bombing or her health concerns. And so what I know is that by the time I remember, I was 6 years old or 7 years old. She had some disease spells and some autoimmune system disorder. And later on in her 40s and 50s, she had some issues with blood production, and she had to get kind of a blood booster sort of injection every other week, which also I didn't know back then. Um, she was going to the clinic to get that booster every other week, and I was already in high school, but I did not know, or I was not registering. And in her 50s, she got cancer, and it spread, and she passed away in early 60s at the age of 62. So I was growing up kind of surrounded by that time, I was growing up in the 70s in Hiroshima, in the city. Most of the people in my generation, they have one or two family members who experienced the bombing or extended family members. So it was not that special, but I was very aware that, the city is has this history and there is some kind of secrecy about my mother. I somehow knew that she had experienced the bombing, but I also couldn't bring it up with her. And I think perhaps I kind of, as a child, you don't want to face your parents' vulnerability. So somehow I knew that asking it makes her vulnerable. Um, and also, there was discrimination against the hibakusha. Hibakusha is the people who suffered from the atomic bombing. And sometimes it is translated as survivors. But I have some hesitation to use the term survivors because, like my mother, you never know if you survived until you die. She might have survived at the time of the bombing, but then the aftermath or residual radiation affected her. So I would say people who suffer from the atomic bombing. So hibakusha were discriminated against by the fellow Japanese citizens, and especially women in the 50s, 60s, 70s, women's job in Japan were often considered as, bringing a son who can carry on the family names. It's not like that anymore. Actually, more girls were preferred sometimes. But back then, having a family lineage was so important culturally, and no one wants to have a woman who has who are fragile, or whose health was dubious, or people wondering if they were barren, or maybe their babies were defected, or that kind of rumors, or maybe there's no scientific proof yet, so we don't know for sure in terms of hereditary influences. But people don't want to take risk. So I guess partly because of that, my mom didn't want to talk about it. Not just talking about it is to revisit the experiences. That itself is harsh, or it's difficult. But also, I think that she doesn't want me to carry on this sort of, not legacy per se, but this discriminatory treatment against the hibakusha and their children. So their children is called Nisei, the second generation of hibakusha. I belong to sort of younger generation of the second generation, but older second generation of hibakusha, they sometimes have had a hard time in, for example, at the entrance exam to a company. When they were finding a job, they were having interviews with companies. They sometimes were asked where they are from, and if you say Hiroshima, you would be asked, when, where, what about your parents, that questions. Or some second generation had a difficult time in finding their spouses because of this discrimination. So it's always there in my upbringing, and I think that's why I wanted to kind of delve into it.
So would you say there is a general culture of silence? I know here in the States, our World War II veterans are often called the silent generation because they don't want to talk about the trauma they inflicted on others or were inflicted upon. Mm-hmm. So what made you unique? Why you of all the Nisei? I suppose other Nisei are also interested in this as well, but why you?
Yeah, why me? No, I think that's a great question, and especially I'm very grateful that you brought up this notion of silence, because that's a big issue. However, this is probably not just particular to Japanese hibakusha. What I found since I came here, part of the reasons I wanted to study in the United States is that when you grew up in Hiroshima in the 70s and 80s, everyone was saying that the nuclear bomb needs to go. We have to get rid of it. And there is no other options. That's the only narrative I grew up with. So I was wondering why, those hibakusha were talking about the abolition of nuclear weapons for decades by that time. And this message is not necessarily be heard in the international community. So I wanted to know the answer, and that was the reason I came to the United States. But what I found in the United States was that there were actually far more hibakusha in the United States because of the uranium mines and because of the nuclear tests, which the US has had 1,032 times. And after disintegrating the nuclear weapons, all the nuclear weapons and nuclear waste, what are we going to do with nuclear waste? So because of that process, from the uranium mine through production, through disintegration, and of course the nuclear tests, every point of this production, there are so many hibakusha. and they also had a hard time in talking about it. And the same thing again in Fukushima. You cannot even say the word of radiation. That's such a no-no word, such a taboo word. So it is interesting why this silence, and partly because of discrimination. And in the case of the United States, I think it's the combination of economics and patriotism. Because the bomb, we tend to think that the bomb is protecting us, right? Whether or not you buy it or you subscribe to that idea or not, that's the kind of official narrative. The bomb, nuclear bombs are protecting us. So it's hard for people who are suffering from it to say that, no, it's not, because it's about the national policy and it's about, the military. And most of the places where people are suffering were actually very much to this day are actually dependent upon such nuclear industry for its economic survival. So, because of that reasons, economic reasons, and also this ideological nationalism or patriotism, it's very hard to voice their suffering.
So this leads to my next question. Another way that discourses and stories become silent is just through the passage of time and forgetting. We just celebrated the 75th, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the bombings, both here in the States and in Japan. What were you paying attention to in these commemorations?
Right. This year's commemoration was very much different, as you can tell, right? Because of the pandemics. So this was very different. Supposedly it was going to be a big one because of the 75th anniversary, but it was much smaller. No foreign guests, like non-Japanese guests, were invited, which usually there are, American ambassadors and the UN representatives. Those people would come to Hiroshima or Nagasaki. However, another exception this year, which was scheduled, was the Tokyo Olympics. Right. And actually the closing of Tokyo Olympics falls onto August 9th, which was the 75th commemoration of Nagasaki bombing, which means that this is kind of my hypothesis, but the Japanese government, if they were having the closing, Olympic Games closing on August 9th, the Prime Minister would not attend Nagasaki's commemoration. Okay. Right? Because he would most likely be at the closing ceremony in Tokyo.
Right.
And that Olympic Games was considered as the Restoration Olympics or Recovery Olympics, clearly thinking of Fukushima. But of course, Fukushima is far from being recovered. I'm sorry to say this because there are many people who are living there, who want to go back there. But it seems to me that it's not, remotely close to full recovery. But because of the Olympics and because of Japan itself wanting to have the nuclear weapons in the future, I think the government deliberately scheduled the Olympic closing on August 9th. Wow. So that it's a closure of any kind of radiation harm to this country. We are done.
Wow.
So that's my hypothesis.
So that's another kind of silencing, right?
Exactly.
Schedule something over it. And then, a third silencer comes in, which is the coronavirus, and says, no, you can't silence it that way. Right. And so maybe the story will continue in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. So there are ways to silence those voices, and in many ways, in many aspects.
Yep. So let's talk about the other side of that. How do you not be silent? How do you transmit the story down. I imagine that your first book, Beyond the Mushroom Cloud, Commemoration, Religion and Responsibility After Hiroshima, 2011, was part of this effort. And you were describing other people's efforts not to forget, right? To remember, repurpose, make useful.
Right. Yeah. Right. And then that will bring us back to the question of why me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I was probably a little bit more obsessed with this compared to other people because of my upbringing, and so my first book was the product of me feeling kind of that's still a process of recovering from a shock between the gap, how much the US knows about the atomic bombing, or how the atomic bombing or nuclear weapons are perceived and even supported by some narratives. And whereas in Japan, as I told you, that it's only one narrative, especially for me growing up in Hiroshima. So there are two distinctive narratives which do not necessarily see eye to eye, right? So that's like, how can I fill the gaps? And that's also the theme of my recent book, which is in Japanese. So I guess I just wanted to know the differences and how can we actually talk about this, and partly also because this is not just me feeling shocked by the differences, but actually there were interactions between the audience and me and my students and me. Sometimes I was student was upset, because I'm talking about the atomic bombing with this, unfamiliar name, right? Some kind of Asian name and Asian looking woman talking about the bomb. Some students feel very defensive. Not that I'm blaming them for it. My goal is that no one should be harmed by radiation. Like, I don't want to see anyone, like my students or anyone, suffer from radiation exposure. But students can be very defensive. So all those, tension and conflicts. So those things also kind of pushed me that I have to deal with this. And that's one reason. The second reason is that perhaps guilt, because I was not able to bring this. I was not courageous enough to talk about this with my mother, and how she understood the bombing, how she thinks of this, like how she came to terms with it. So this narratives, understandings, master narratives, personal narratives. So those things were very much intriguing to me to sort out.
So we've discussed your familial background, the ethics and the politics around these discussions. Where does religion come in? Because it seems like, well, if I recall from reading about Hiroshima in John Hersey's book, which I think is assigned in high schools all across the United States, religion plays an interesting role there, but you take a different perspective in your book. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Right. Thank you for bringing up John Hersey, because that's the theme that I am actually working on right now. Actually, this Friday evening at 8:00, John Hersey's grandson, Canon Hersey, and Coco Kondo, who is Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto, who appears in John Hersey's Hiroshima, they were having conversations, and I will serve as a moderator. So it's just coming in a couple of days, and I should be ready for it. Yeah, thank you for bringing that, because the new theme, which I'm working on right now, is sort of moral bricolage.
Okay.
That's the William Lafleur was using it, and of course bricolage itself is a known concept. But it seems to me that Christianity in Japan is not so much taken seriously because of the number is law. But what intrigued me is that, there is a saying that goes 90% of Japanese people practice Shinto, 80% practice Buddhism, and 70% households celebrate Christmas, right? And so everyone is kind of, practicing amalgamation, pick and choose. That's the religious sensitivities over there, it seems to me. But when it comes to numbers, when who is considered as Christians is very strict. That's a kind of 19th century Protestant Christianity understanding of Christians, right? You have to profess your faith, go to the church. But, right, yeah. And who else, which Buddhists would do that? How many of people who claim they are Buddhists knows about sutras or goes to temples regularly or have relationships with priests, So it seems we are using very different sort of categorizations for Shinto and Buddhism and Christianity. So I'd rather see the Christian cultural influences of Christianity because, people probably wouldn't know about Buddha's birthday, but you cannot you cannot ignore Christmas, right? So in that sense, cultural influences of Christianity is rather huge, and its influences on the production of the atomic bomb memory is also big. And that's, I touched upon a little bit in my first book, but now I'm working on is that there are different religious groups who are coming to Hiroshima, trying to construct a narrative which suit their agenda, right? And John Hersey's book is one of them. I'm not saying like John Hersey is trying to manipulate the narratives, but he was the son of missionary, right? So he was not necessarily abided by Christian faith per se, but he has a high moral standard, and he sort of his parents handed down this Christian morality in him, and the people whom he interviewed, they are all Catholic priests or Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto, Methodist minister, all religious figures or churchgoers. In other words, in a larger categories, they are Christians. And Hiroshima was very much influential in that sense, or influenced by Christian framework to understand the atomic bombing. And another significance that I would like to revisit John Hersey now is that last year, high school in Chicago Public High School, one high school in north side of the city, they dumped a number of copies, physical copies of John Hersey's Hiroshima, along with John Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. And it was a shocking, I have a photo, I wish I could show you, but it's a shocking photo image because, the dumpster, huge dumpster, and there are just scattered, Hiroshima scattered, Great Gatsby, and it's just many books are there.
Okay.
And that became a little bit controversial. The school didn't necessarily answer the questions, but their rationale, which was because of the budget, they needed to keep some space for new books, and also they are understaffed, so they needed to reduce the number of the books just to manage to make it manageable. And also Hiroshima is available online. But my experiences teaching this topic for last 17 years at DePaul is that first 10 years, perhaps, or maybe first 10 years, 2/3 of the students have read Hiroshima, even partially. But nowadays, I don't think even 1/3 of the students have read Hiroshima in high school. Some of them have never heard of it. And then I saw this image, Hiroshima being discarded. So I'm trying to make this campaign that bring Hiroshima back to school again, sort of.
That's really interesting. If you can almost read a conspiracy theory of 9/11 happens, frames of war are accelerated, gets dropped from various public school systems.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah,
That sounds like a very
I
interesting
don't know.
project. Yeah.
I don't know. I try to, give benefits of doubt, and like it
course.
makes sense. Budget and
Mhm.
space, and it's available online. But the reality is, because it's available online, doesn't mean that more people are reading it.
That's right. Yeah.
So
One thing that I learned from your book was just how Buddhist Hiroshima was. What's the statistic that you cite? 70%? 80%?
yeah, this is just a rough number.
Yeah.
90% Shinto,
90.
80% Buddhism. But actually, I have just happened to have this.
Okay.
Let me read it. 2018 national statistics. Shinto, people who claim that they practice Shinto is 86 million. Buddhism, 85.
Okay.
And Christians, close to 2 million.
And what about for Hiroshima?
Oh, in Hiroshima, sorry, I don't have the statistics in Hiroshima.
Okay.
It is a whole country, national country. But of course, if you add everything, it exceeds the entire the total,
yes.
right, population. Yeah. So, yeah. But in Hiroshima, I do not have the statistics, but Hiroshima, as I said in the book, is known for this kind of adamant True Pure Land Buddhist schools.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about, for our viewers who might not know what Pure Land Buddhism is? It's a special form of Pure Land Buddhism.
Oh, sure.
Shin, right?
Right. Shin Buddhism. Yeah. Maybe Shin Buddhism might be an easier term to those who may not be familiar with. But there is True Land Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah,
Pure
True
Land.
Land Buddhism. No, Pure Land. I'm sorry.
Pure Land.
Pure Land Buddhism.
True.
Pure Land Buddhism. And Pure Land itself, the idea came from China. Mm-hmm. Right, and it spread in the Heian period, like 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, but especially the 13th centuries, those sort of Reformation period in Japan, right, predecessors. It's like people who belonged to this huge temple, Tendai school temple, mm-hmm. They started branching off. And one of them is Shinran, who is the so-called founder of True Pure Land Buddhism, and especially because back then this Tendai school was so powerful politically, financially. And what they are looking to is only to those aristocrats and those people who can donate a large money to their institution. Mm-hmm. And of course, they were not so much concerned about those people who are illiterate or who are, who do not have time to devote to textual hermeneutics and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So that's why Shinran was more paying attention to the so-called commoners, and she left, and she started this. He left, but more like he was excommunicated, right? He was just got rid of that school.
Banished first, and then he comes back.
Right, yeah. And he's also often compared to Martin Luther, right? because he said faith alone, and he left the big institution, religious institution, and married to a former nun and had kids and all those things. But True Pure Land's history is, of course, it has ups and downs, and it was sometimes, like, for example, during the war period, Oda Nobunaga, one of those warriors in the 16th century, he was trying to eliminate this True Pure Land school because they were becoming more influential, more powerful. So they had this fight for over decades. And during the Edo period as well, especially what is known is in Kyushu Island, True Pure Land adherents were having a hard time. They were, their faith was prescribed. So I suppose that there is some kind of, and True Pure Land as well, but True Pure Land is also said single-minded. So they tend to have, they are more like, almost like monotheistic, right? Amida Buddha alone. So in that sense, they can be very powerful. They can be more they may not have some kind of ambiguities in their faith. Or in a better way to say it, they have more focused on this faith, which is, of course, a threat to secular authorities. And so this is the sort of the rough sketch of Shin Buddhism, True Pure Land Buddhism.
So the major practice of Pure Land Buddhism is calling on Amida Buddha's name in order to be reborn in the Pure Land.
Exactly.
Because it's too hard to get into Nirvana.
Right.
Because we're in Mappo, or the end of times.
Right. And interestingly, at some point in that process, in the developing their doctrines, enlightenment is not that important anymore, which is very peculiar, right? In Buddhism, and enlightenment is not important. But more like rebirth in Amida's Pure Land is far more focused and far more important. And that's the kind of peculiar or characteristics, I would say.
And so the turn in true Pure Land Buddhism, this Japanese development then, is about sincerity of faith and not just pure number, right? Not just doing it over and over again. It has to do with sincerity, and you only have to do it once, potentially.
Exactly,
right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The difference is from Pure Land is that Pure Land is encouraging you to chant, practice of chanting. But in True Pure Land Buddhism or Shin Buddhism, as you said, if you mean it, then once in lifetime is good enough.
And you argue that it has ethical implications, right? For hibakusha that might have been practicing or thinking with Shin Buddhist lenses, right? How does the argument go there? What is the unique ethical take that Shin Buddhism offers us for thinking about victimhood or responsibility?
Right, and I think what is intriguing to me about Shin Buddhist idea is that you have to entrust Amida Buddha 100%. Right? And whatever good deed you do is not because of you. It's because of the power, the other power, which is Amida's power. So Amida's power works through you. That's the idea. So of course, this idea may seem to be contradicting sort of Western understanding of the self or free will. Where is free will? What is who is the agency? But I also noticed for the last decade or so many, not theologians, but actually many philosophers, many environmental ethicists, or even political scientists are reformulating the idea of agency,
Mhm.
right? So since the Enlightenment, we are familiar with this idea that agency or independent, autonomous self. But lots of thinkers are now, more than decades, saying that that's illusion. They are not even Buddhists. They are even political scientists who is, actually, I'm talking about Jane Bennett. She's
Mm.
talking about, how electrical grid can be considered as agency, political agency. So in that sense, the kind of Buddhist idea of the self is sort of diffusive, not closed entity, autonomous and um, independent from everything else and autonomous. That idea is becoming a well, passe might not be a good word, but it seems like it came out of the Enlightenment tradition, but we are coming into different phase. And especially when you are thinking of environmental ethics and anthropocentrism has been criticized. And in the same way, the idea of agency needs to be reconfigured. And in that sense, I think Shin Buddhism has lots to contribute to. But at the same time, when it comes to responsibility, it's a little bit tricky because if you do not have the independent autonomous agency, how can we impute responsibility? So it is, but this is also the issues that other thinkers who are claiming that we needed to reformulate agency, the idea of agency also deals with this idea of responsibility. Then how can we think of responsibility? And in that sense, I have not flushed out that idea in my book, but I see that last decades, I've been more thinking of those ideas. I've been learning about other thinkers' ideas of agencies and responsibilities and see some similarities or common threads in Shin Buddhism understanding, even understanding of the bombings. Like they are not necessarily putting a finger on, this is because of you, like they are not doing that. They are saying this is because of Hiroshima citizens, because of Japanese, because of humankind, which is, I admit that it is a dangerous idea, diffusing responsibility, which means no one is actually accountable for it. But at the same time, we also have to reformulate the idea of responsibility, what it means to be responsible, especially for such a thing as the atomic bombing. How can you be responsible, right, for the lives lost or the lives altered drastically afterwards? So I guess what they are sort of challenging us is that this idea of agency, this idea of responsibility.
Your discussion of Shin Buddhist ethics and survivorship or responsibility, um, it really made me think of a poem by the engaged Vietnamese Buddhist, Thich Nhat Hanh, where he describes, he says, I am both the frog and the fly that the frog eats, right? He's both responsible and the victim of something horrible, right? Both agent and not the agent. And he wants, I think, to encourage people to think beyond, again, the individual self and to move to this more interdependent model of agency, perhaps.
Yeah, like ontology is now being, I see after I published that book, I see more people who are engaging in different ways to see or to formulate ontology. And the word is thin ontology or weak ontology, or, people are trying to see. But I see that the vantage point of religious studies is that we can talk about something, kind of metaphysical. So in other words, how, and I think that in that sense, Jane Bennett is very courageous talking about, something non-organic beings, counting non-organic beings as a political agent, which
Mhm.
is usually what religious studies scholars would do. So I see that some kind of overlapping themes and ideas, interdisciplinary, and but that's something, the vantage point of religious studies, because we have some traditions of dealing with that sort of ideas, how we think of ourselves or our relation to the world or
Mhm.
our relation to other beings, or even like I would call it, using this anthropologist's term, other than humans. So
Mhm.
it's not just animals and plants, but other than humans could be the spirits or the dead.
Mountains,
Yeah, yeah,
rivers. Yeah.
right. And how can we enrich our world, our perception of the world with those ideas is something we could contribute to.
Well, it really does seem like these religious discourses that come from Hibakusha have a
Mm-hmm.
lot to teach us about moving forward, um, thinking about responsibility, thinking about reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I noticed that you published a new book
Mm-hmm.
this year in Japanese for Japanese audiences about how Americans talk about nuclear discourse.
Right.
What are your hopes for that book?
Um, yeah, well, since I wrote it in Japanese, and I was shocked at how rusty my Japanese became, but that's a different story. Um, so I guess because, like me, when I was growing up, I was only familiar with one narrative, and I was so shocked. But to learn about the American narratives, which also means that I was not ready to listen to other side. I don't have
Mhm.
to agree with. I don't have to, I don't have to be um, a part of that narrative. But at least if I want to stand firm on my own understanding, and if I want to communicate my idea, I definitely needed to know their context, their understanding, their interpretation, their history. And so I wanted people in Japan to know how the atomic bombings as well as nuclear bombs have been understood, or the idea has been diffused in many venues. I even talk about entertainment, such as superheroes like Spider-Man, um, Hulk, or all those superheroes were actually empowered by radiation exposure.
Mhm.
So it's always there, like people um, in the United States and perhaps in Japan in different ways, but radiation exposure is almost imminent, and in the form of popular music or Hollywood movies, or as I said, those superheroes. So if people in Japan are um, the people in Japan are sincerely working for, many of them are working for the abolition of nuclear weapons, then in order to get their message across, I want them to know what's going on here and what kind of narratives would penetrate or would be hard in the United States. So that was my intention to write the book.
Well, I wish you a lot of success. That seems like a very important project to help Japanese peace activists understand their audience better and craft other ways that we might move forward in this world in which nuclears are still a huge problem.
I
uh,
think so too. I think
yeah.
so too. It seems to me that it has been compartmentalized. Somehow nuclear weapons is part of politics or international politics, but actually, it's environmental justice issues, human rights issues, and even gender issues.
That's right.
Um, so yeah, I'm hoping that that idea is that this is actually very near us. It's not just those policymakers'
Mhm.
issues.
It is, and it's a religious issue too, I think,
Religious
right?
issues,
Yeah.
definitely. I think
Yeah.
so. Apocalypse always has the image of the mushroom clouds, right?
Well, on that positive note, thank you for joining us today for conversation.
Thank you so
And I
much.
hope I can talk to you again soon after Corona is all over and we're back to normal, I hope.